Imagine 15,000 men stumbling through the mountains of Bulgaria, their eyes gouged out, and following the faint voice of a single guide who can barely see through his one remaining eye. This isn't fiction, this isn't mythology, this is actual history. You see, in the summer of 1014, one man's order would create a sight so horrific that it would literally kill a king and destroy an empire forever. But was this the calculated move of a strategic genius, or the monstrous act of a madman? The primary source for the story comes from John Skylitzes, a Byzantine chronicler who lived just decades after these events unfolded. His account is chilling in its precision. The emperor divided the prisoners into groups of 100 men, blinded 99 men in each of those groups, and left one man in each group with one eye left so that he could lead the others home. Meet Basil II, the emperor of Byzantium, and a man who would earn the chilling nickname, I'm gonna butcher this, I've tried so many times, Bulgar or the Bulgar Slayer. Born in 958, he ruled the Byzantine Empire for nearly half a century, from 976 to 1025, making him one of the longest reigning emperors in Byzantine history. But Basil wasn't born to rule. He was thrust into power at age 18 when his father Romanos II died unexpectedly, and for the first 13 years of his reign, he was essentially a puppet, controlled by powerful generals and court officials who treated him as a figurehead. Everything changed in 989 when Basil finally consolidated his power. He had witnessed decades of humiliation at the hands of the Bulgarian Empire, and he was determined to end it once and for all. The Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuil wasn't just some barbarian kingdom, it was a sophisticated Orthodox Christian state that controlled much of the Balkans. For Basil, this wasn't just about territory, this was about proving that he was no longer the weak puppet emperor everyone had dismissed in the beginning. The question isn't just what happened at a place called Kleidion on July 29, 1014. It's why a Christian emperor would choose such a horrific punishment, and whether this single act of brutality was brilliant strategy or inexcusable cruelty. Now, to understand the magnitude of what happened at Kleidion, we need to step back into the world of late 10th century Eastern Europe. When Basil II finally took real control in 989, he inherited a nightmare scenario. You see, the Bulgarian Empire had been raiding Byzantine territory for decades, and under Tsar Samuil they had captured key fortresses including the vital city of Thessalonica, modern-day Thessaloniki, the second most important city in the Byzantine Empire at the time. Now you see though, Samuil wasn't just a warrior, he was a skilled diplomat and administrator. He had united the Bulgarian tribes under his rule and created a military machine that had repeatedly humiliated Byzantine forces. His capital at Ohrid was a center of learning and culture. But what made the conflict so personal for Basil was the memory of his predecessor's failures. Emperor John Zemeckis had been killed in 976, possibly by poison, after a disastrous campaign against the Bulgarians. And Basil had watched his empire's prestige crumble right in front of him. The chronicler Michael Sellos, who personally knew Basil, wrote that the emperor burned with an unquenchable desire to avenge the humiliation suffered by his predecessors. This wasn't just about conquest. No, this was about redemption. And for 25 years, Basil campaigned against the Bulgarians. It was a grinding war of attrition fought in mountain passes and river valleys, where both sides committed acts of shocking brutality. But by 1014, Basil has systematically dismantled the Bulgarian defensive network. He had captured fortress after fortress after fortress, cutting off Samuil's supply lines and isolating his forces. The Bulgarian Empire was dying, but it refused to surrender without a fight. Now, modern historians note that Basil's previous treatment of prisoners had already established a pattern of deliberate cruelty. In Georgia, he had ordered the blinding of Armenian prisoners, and in northern Syria he had ordered mass executions. But nothing prepared the world for what was about to come at Kleidion. Now, the name Kleidion comes from the Greek word Kleidion, meaning little key. It was a narrow mountain pass between what is now Bulgaria and Greece, and the Belasitsa Mountains. For medieval armies, controlling this pass was like holding the key to the Balkans itself. And in July 1014, Samuil made a fatal strategic decision. With his forces reduced by years of warfare, he chose to make a stand at Kleidion. His army, estimated by modern historians around 20,000 men, took defensive positions in this narrow pass. But what Samuel didn't know was that Basil had spent decades studying Bulgarian tactics. The emperor had learned from every defeat, every retreat, and every failed siege. He wasn't just planning to defeat these Bulgarians, he was planning to destroy and humiliate them. The battle began at dawn on July 29th. Basil's strategy was methodical, almost surgical, you could say. Instead of a direct assault, he sent a force under the general, I'm gonna butcher this, Nikephoros Xiphias, to circle around the Bulgarian position. While Samuel's forces were distracted by the frontal assault, Xiphias attacked from behind. The Bulgarian army, caught between two forces in the narrow pass, was annihilated. Samuel himself barely escaped with a small bodyguard, but the chronicles record that he was wounded in the fighting. John Skalitzes, our primary source, records that the Byzantine forces completely routed the Bulgarian army. The number of prisoners taken is consistently reported as 15,000 across multiple sources, a staggering figure that represents the core of the Bulgarian military. But the real horror was yet to come. As the dust settled and the wounded were separated from the dead, Emperor Basil II stood among his greatest military triumph. What happened next would define his legacy forever. The chroniclers tell us that Basil looked upon his 15,000 prisoners and made a decision that would shock even the hardened warriors of the 11th century. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was a carefully planned act of psychological warfare. The historical chronicles record Basil's order with chilling precision. John Skalitzes, writing in the 11th century, states, "The emperor divided the prisoners into groups of 100 men, blinded 99 men in each group, and left one man in each group with one eye so that he could lead the others home." Let's understand the mathematics of this horror. 15,000 prisoners divided into groups of 100 meant 150 groups. In each group, 99 men would be completely blinded. That's 14,850 men. The remaining 150 would keep one eye to serve as guides. But what did blinding actually mean in the 11th century? Byzantine medical texts of the period describe the process. Hot irons were used to burn out the eyes, or in some cases, knives were used to cut the optical nerves. The goal was to ensure permanent blindness while keeping the victim alive. This wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated psychological warfare. Basil wanted to create what the chroniclers called a sight that would break the spirit of all of Bulgaria. But the sheer scale of the operation tells us something else. This was planned in advance. Modern historians estimate that blinding 14,850 men would have taken several days. This wasn't a spontaneous act of battlefield rage. This was a systematic process that required organization, supplies, and the participation of hundreds, if not thousands, of Byzantine soldiers. What's remarkable is that multiple independent sources confirm the basic facts. The chronicler Michael Sellos, who knew Basil personally, mentions the blinding. The Arab historian Yahya of Antioch, writing from outside the Byzantine Empire, also records this event. The chroniclers struggle to describe the horror of what followed. Skalitzes writes that the mountains echoed with screams. Even some Byzantine soldiers, hardened by years of warfare, were reportedly disturbed by what they were forced to do and see. But Basil's psychological masterpiece wasn't complete. He had one final devastating element to his plan. The blinded soldiers weren't just to be abandoned, they were to be sent home as living messengers of Byzantine power. Picture this, 15,000 men, their eyes destroyed, 150 eyes between all 15,000 men remaining, beginning a journey of over 100 miles through the Bulgarian mountains. Every 100 men followed a single guide who could barely see through one remaining eye. This wasn't just punishment, it was a message written in human suffering. The journey back to Samuel's capital at Ohrid took weeks. The blind soldiers, many of them dying from their wounds and infections, had to navigate mountain passes, river crossings, and forest paths while completely dependent on their one-eyed guides. Local chronicles from the period describe the horror of this procession. Villages along the route reported hearing the voices of the blind soldiers calling out to each other, trying to maintain formation as they stumbled through the wilderness. Modern medical historians estimate that many of the blinded soldiers would have died from their injuries within days. Infection was almost inevitable, and the trauma of the blinding process would have been fatal for many. The 15,000 who started the journey home may have been considerably fewer by the time they reached Bulgarian territory. When the first groups of blinded soldiers reached Semyul's capital, the chroniclers tell us the sight was indescribable. John Skylitzes records, when the Tsar saw the multitude of his blinded soldiers, he was struck with such grief that he fell to the ground. The chroniclers are consistent in their account of what happened next. Semyul, upon seeing his blinded army, suffered what appears to have been a massive heart attack. He collapsed and died within 2 days, reportedly brought on by the sight of his blind soldiers. But the psychological impact went far beyond just one man's death. The sight of 15,000 blinded soldiers stumbling through Bulgarian territory had exactly the effect Basil had calculated. Village after village surrendered without a fight. The message was clear. This is what happens when you resist Basil II. The Bulgarian Empire, which had resisted Byzantium for decades, crumbled almost immediately. By 1018, just 4 years after Kleidion, all Bulgarian territories had been incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. What's remarkable is how quickly the Bulgarian nobility capitulated. Many of Semyul's generals and governors simply opened their gates to Byzantine forces. The memory of those 15,000 blinded soldiers had broken the will of an entire people. Modern historians have intensely debated the accuracy of this story. Basil's track record suggests that he had been known to treat prisoners of war with brutality. We have reports many years before Kleidion of the emperor ordering the blinding of prisoners of war in Bulgaria and Georgia. The primary source is John Skylitzes, who lived from about 1040 to 1101 and served as a high-ranking Byzantine official. His chronicle is considered the major historical source for the period and is cited constantly in modern scholarship. But was he exaggerating for dramatic effect? What gives the story credibility is that multiple independent sources confirm the basic facts. Arab chroniclers, Bulgarian sources, and other Byzantine historians all mention the mass blinding, though they sometimes differ on exact numbers. Recent archaeological work in the Kleidion area has uncovered evidence of a major battle, including weapons, armor fragments, and mass graves. While we can't prove the blinding story through archaeology, we can confirm that a massive military engagement took place there. Some scholars argue that mass blinding wasn't unprecedented in medieval warfare. The Fatimid Caliphate had used similar tactics, and there are records of mass mutilations in other conflicts. But the scale of what happened at Kleidion was exceptional. Military historians point out that Basil's strategy was coldly logical. In one horrific act, he had ended a war that had consumed 2 decades and countless lives. The blinding of 15,000 men potentially saved thousands more from death in future battles. But even by medieval standards, Basil's actions were controversial. Byzantine military manuals of the period discussed the proper treatment of prisoners, and mass mutilation was generally condemned by Christian theologians. What's undeniable is that Basil's strategy worked. The Bulgarian Empire never recovered, and Basil achieved his ultimate goal. But at what cost? Some historians wonder if the weight of his actions at Kleidion haunted him for the rest of his life. The blinding of the Bulgarian army at Kleidion had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate collapse of the Bulgarian Empire. Under Basil II, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest territorial extent since the 7th century. With the Bulgarian threat eliminated, Basil was free to campaign elsewhere. He conquered parts of Armenia, secured the eastern frontier against the Arabs, and extended Byzantine control deep into the Caucasus. The empire was more powerful than it had been in centuries. But Basil's methods also had darker consequences. His reputation for extreme brutality became legendary throughout the medieval world. Enemies surrendered rather than face capture, but allies also began to fear and distrust Byzantine power. The emperor's contemporaries struggled with how to judge him. To many Byzantines, he was a hero who had restored the empire's greatness, but to others, he was a tyrant whose methods violated Christian principles. The Orthodox Church found itself in a difficult position. While they celebrated Basil's victory, some theologians questioned whether his methods were compatible with Christian teachings. The mass blinding became a source of ongoing theological debate. The story of the blinded army entered medieval legend and folklore. Bulgarian epic poetry preserved the memory of the tragedy, while Byzantine chroniclers continued to debate its morality for centuries. Today, in both Bulgaria and Greece, there are monuments to the Battle of Kleidion, but they tell very different stories. One of Bulgarian martyrdom, the other of Byzantine triumph. The blinding of 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers at Kleidion stands as one of history's most calculated acts of psychological warfare. It was brutal, it was effective, and it changed the course of European history. But it also raises questions that remain relevant today. In our modern world, we have the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. But in 1014, there were no such protections for prisoners of war. Basil's actions, while horrific, were not technically illegal by the standards of his time. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power. Was Basil II a brilliant strategist who ended a devastating war with one decisive action? Or was he a war criminal who committed an inexcusable atrocity? Today, the mountains where 15,000 men lost their sight are peaceful. Tourists visit the area, often unaware of the horror that unfolded there over 1,000 years ago. But that memory of that day in 1014 reminds us that sometimes the most effective strategies are also the most morally troubling. Basil II died in 1025, never having married, never having children. He left behind an empire at its zenith, but also a legacy stained by the screams of 15,000 blinded men. History remembers him as both a hero and a monster, and perhaps that's exactly what he was. So what do you think? Was Basil II a strategic genius who ended a brutal war with one decisive action? Or did he cross the line that no ruler should cross? And honestly, how do we judge historical figures by the standards of their time versus our own modern moral framework? I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective on this complex historical figure. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into Byzantine history fascinating, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Crimes of the Crown, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the dark secrets of royal history.